Hello, I'm Dr. Chris Brown and this is the Conservation Hackers vlog. Now, I've often faced situations in analyses when I have more variables and more complex relationships than what I can represent with plain old vanilla linear regression. Take for example habitat change. If you have climate driving forest habitat in turn drives the distribution of a bird, then forest is a mediating variable between birds and climate. Now, we can't represent these mediating relationships with linear regression. What we need is another method like structural equation modelling. So, I was recently over at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Institute talking with one of the world experts in structural equation modelling, Dr. Jon Lefcheck. In fact, Jon wrote the R package piecewiseSEM, which is one of the key packages people are using now to implement SEM for their observational and experimental data. And I was having such a great time walking with Jon and also another colleague, Dr. Marc Hensel, in the woods and talking science that I really wanted to capture some of that conversation on video. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion we had in the Smithsonian woods. Thank you.
So, structural equation modeling, I think it's a super powerful tool because it's really rooted in strong understanding of natural systems, right? Yeah. So you have to know conceptually the questions that you're going after. Yep. You have to have some intuition around the system. Yeah. It's not one of these machine learning, big data techniques where you throw all the data in for some network analysis and it comes in and tells you what's important. Yep. You think you know what's important. And then you challenge your understanding of data. Yeah. And that's one of the things I think is really cool. It's rooted in a deep understanding of the system, and it's also rooted in cause and effect.
Yeah,
I'm gonna wait for you.
I know
to
that,
go down
that did look quite dangerous. No, I think that you're exactly right. The fact that it's rooted in cause and effect is why I think structural equation modeling applies really well to the ecological questions that myself and a lot of my colleagues ask, is because our questions come from experimental ecology, come from observing patterns in the field, and oftentimes our ability to test those patterns or the generality of those patterns or to determine the processes is limited to one experiment over one short period of time or so on and so forth, and that sort of that direct test of cause and effect, and then multiple layers of the direct test of cause and effect, and then also the ability to test indirect effects along that sort of.
Marc, you raised two really interesting. The first is this idea of causation. I think when we're all trained in statistics, that number one mantra is correlation does not imply causation. So there's always this strong, discouraging notion that whenever you're analyzing, say, observational data, you can't really speak about cause and effect. Right. But I think it was Bill Shipley in his book, where he's like, well, actually, correlation does imply causation sometimes. Yeah. And the thing is you have to, again, have an understanding of the system in order to structure your question so that you are capable of looking at it. Yeah. So the classic example is smoking. So back in the 50s, there was all this evidence emerging that smoking caused lung cancer. And it's actually the smoking industry that hired the eminent statistician, Sir Ronald Fisher, to come and defend their view. And basically he said, yeah, well, smoking does cause cancer. That's one interpretation. But it's just a correlation, so it could go in the other direction. And he suggested that, in fact, it was the getting cancer that led people to smoke, to maybe soothe the pain. Then he suggested, well, there's actually a third option, which is that this correlation is entirely spurious. So you could get cancer and also smoke, and maybe that's linked by some unmeasured driver, like you have a genetic pathway that just predisposes you to both, but there's actually no causal relationship. Right. And so it was effective. The nail in the coffin, so to speak, was when people started looking at the deposition of tar in the lungs. And they found that the spar from the cigarettes was mutagenic and causing lung cancer. Right. And so there was this pathway that was linked between the presence of tar, smoking, and cancer, which is to say, people would just spontaneously sprout tar in their lungs. And it was from that they built out this causal relationship that they then validated with data. Of course, now we know smoking does indeed cause cancer, and hence the warnings on every package of cigarettes you find. So that's the one cool thing that you mentioned. The other cool thing is the ability to get at those indirect effects. Yeah. And so this is where the example of smoking comes back. You can identify these mediating factors that allow you to speak to causality, which is very cool. So without any information on tar in the lungs, you're back to where Ron Fisher was. Could be anything. But as you build out your network, you build out your model, and you build those causal assumptions in, you validate with data, suddenly you have a much better picture of what's really going on in your system. And I think that's the strength for ecology. We know a lot about what drives ecological systems. We know what to control for. That's the whole point of an experiment. But when we're in nature, we can't do that. So we have to include those variables in our model in creative ways to kind of close what we call those backdoors. There's drivers that might generate spurious correlations, and that gives us this cleaner test of causality. So it's by building out these direct and indirect effects of the model, closing these backdoors, accounting for these known covariates, that you can get at this cause and effect principle. Which I think is a really huge leap in ecology. Because really that's what we're interested in. We want to know if we do this, then this happens. And in fact, that's true for everything. AI, computer programming, like this notion of cause and effect is really central in a lot of technologies. But it's particularly important in the changing world like now. We need to know if we make these changes, we lower our carbon emissions, then the effect will be a cooler planet.
Would it be a good idea to use SEM to use structural equation modeling to compare a couple of different, say, views on how an ecosystem works? So, for example, many ecosystems are controlled by a variety of either top-down predator effects or bottom-up, nutrient effects from primary producers upwards. Are there ways to build structural equation models, basically and compare two of them side by side, look at how they fit the data that you have, and use this as to help give us insights on some of these, multiple dynamics that sort of occur at the same time in natural ecosystems?
Absolutely. And again, this is super cool strength of SEM. The engine behind it is the same statistical models we run all the time. Linear regression, generalized linear models, mixed effects models. And so you can string these together in any sort of orientation, and then you can draw on tools that already exist, things like AIC information criteria, AIC, to compare the likelihood, the strength of evidence for different configurations. So you can make your top-down model, you can make your bottom-up model, you can challenge it with data and say, okay, let's compare these two, see which are the more likely, given the data. You can even, and this is very difficult, and there's several criteria you need to satisfy, but actually fit arrows in both directions.
Oh, wow.
So the classic example that I like is you can look at productivity as a driver of diversity, but also diversity as a driver of productivity. And if you structure your model very thoughtfully and satisfy these different conditions, you can actually look at the degree to which the community is responding to resource availability, but then also the diversity of that community is driving its own productivity simultaneously. So you get a lot of power to dissect these systems, these different processes, make these comparisons. And that's why I like SEM.
But the thing is oftentimes there's multiple variables that we measure in the field that go into the sort of the one metric of maybe it's how much sediment is being collected in a marsh, that sort of thing. These rates that are really important for management and conservation organizations to know. Can structural equation modeling be used to sort of build these variables?
That's a great question, Mark. And in fact, it can. So I'm glad you asked it. And these are what we call latent variables, which are these unobserved properties. And they came about in the 1950s. There was a mathematician who was seeking to understand or to quantify these kind of unmeasurable properties. And so the idea was that, for example, you have some intelligence, right? But you can't just say he has this much intelligence and you have that much intelligence. Instead, you can measure indicators as intelligence. You can give people a math test, you can give them a verbal test, you can give them some sort of spatial test. And what he did is use these latent variable modeling techniques to combine those indicators into this single variable, which he called intelligence. And so we can do that now. We can go into nature and look for different indicators of, say, biodiversity. We can get species richness, we can get evenness, we can get functional trait diversity, phylogenetic diversity. And those are all sort of indicators of this underlying concept that we call biodiversity. And then we can integrate those in this SEM framework and ask, okay, so how is biodiversity, which is a suite of these measured properties, has that influenced by environment or human pressures? So there's a lot of strength, I think, in these different techniques that have been integrated into this so-called third generation of SEM that gives you this flexibility to look at these bigger picture concepts.
If you enjoyed that brief introduction to when and where ecologists should be using structural equation models. Now, if you want to learn more, a great place to start is Bill Shipley's book, Cause and Correlation in Biology. Great introduction to SEMs. Another place to look at is the piecewiseSEM R package, which is Jon's package, bespoke designed for analysing structural equation models specifically for ecologists. You can find that on CRAN or GitHub or wherever you get your R packages. And finally, check out Jon Lefcheck's GitHub page. You can find that by Googling for it, or check out the show notes where I'll pop a link down there. I hope you've enjoyed the vlog today. If you liked us, make sure you follow us on YouTube or give us a star or share us with your friends. Thanks.